This happened to myself and a close friend just last month. We decided to go on a 2-night backpacking/camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. We're both very comfortable with nature and spent a lot of time camping, hunting, and fishing. To begin, we hiked about 5 miles into a small lake and set up camp on a small beach. Now, this wasn't a heavily trafficked area, and we didn't expect to run into anyone. Our first night there, as we were sitting around the fire, we saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake at around 10:30. This was fairly unusual. However, we didn't think much of it. But as time went on, this flashlight kept moving around the lake and getting closer and closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering around the woods in the middle of the night, and we didn't particularly want an unwelcomed guest. Once it was clear that the person or people were heading towards our campsite, we moved off into the woods nearby to see who wandered up. I took a small axe with me and my friend had his .22 caliber rifle. Now, we weren't expecting trouble, and we certainly didn't want to make any, but we figured we might as well cover our bases. Now, the moment of truth. The flashlight comes near the light of our fire, and we now see that it's just one man. He had a beard and was probably around his mid-40s. The scary part was that he was carrying what turned out to be a pump-action shotgun. He walked around the campsite a few times and then proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for a minute or so, he came out and yelled,
"I know you're out there. Why don't you come out and say hello?"
My friend and I remained motionless under a hemlock tree about 50 yards away, and that's when this man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods, not too far from where we were. He also swung his flashlight around several times, and after what felt like hours, he grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing we had drying off near the fire and threw them in to burn. My friend, who had trained the .22 with the man, asked me if he should shoot. I told him, absolutely not unless this man spots us and begins to point his own gun in our direction. Thankfully, time passed, and this man began to move off in the direction he had come from. We watched and waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake, and then we ran. We grabbed everything we could fit into my pack and took off. I remember running out that trail with flashlights and making it back to my car as the sun was coming up. We immediately went to the police department and reported all of this. We spoke with some forest rangers and that was it. I haven't heard anything back from the police. This was an odd experience to say the least, and it creeped the hell out of both of us. Let me just start by saying, I'm a female, and I was 19 years old at the time that this occurred. Now, I love camping. Anytime my friends and I come home from college, we'll load up our cooler with beer, grab some gear and go screw around outside. Unfortunately, when I was actually at school, none of my sorority sisters or other friends ever wanted to go with me, so I would often suffer withdrawals from camping. Well, one day the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed some of my gear, hopped in a car I borrowed from a buddy and drove to a spot that was secluded yet within a safe distance to civilization that I could run and get help. It's odd, camping really creeps me out sometimes, but that creepy feeling is also somewhat of a plus for me. It's the same reason that people watch horror movies. It's just fun to be scared. So I made a little camp and got a fire going. I hadn't brought all that much to eat, but I was still enjoying myself, reading and looking around the area, that sort of thing. Time passed, and I began to get the feeling like I was being watched. I decided to stand still in hopes of seeing movement or hearing something to confirm my suspicions. I listened, and then heard a twig crunch over to my right, and then saw a doe bolt from 100 feet or so in front of me. I laughed at myself for being so paranoid and went back to the camp with an armful of wood I'd gathered. I kept freaking myself out all throughout the night, hearing sounds just outside of the ring of light cast by the fire. I always got inside my own head, so I just shrugged it off and kept whittling at a stick I'd been messing with. At around 1 a.m., I decided to go into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I had been slamming beers in the most unladylike fashion and smoking cheap cigars, so I passed out relatively quick. I woke up at about 2 a.m. hearing footsteps. They sounded pretty light and sort of timid. I thought to myself that it was just a deer or some other animal, most likely a raccoon because I'd probably left some food out, but I still kept my guard up though. About 30 minutes of me sleeping with one eye open, I began to hear a rubbing noise and saw the tent fabric being pushed in a bit. I don't know how I didn't ship my sleeping bag, but I just sat there paralyzed with my K-bar in my hand. I desperately wanted to thrust the knife through the tent fabric, but I was still holding out hope that these were just some buddies from a frat joking with me. And then as suddenly as it all began, it stopped. I was starting to feel slightly more secure because daylight would be coming in about 2 or 3 more hours, but I sure as shit wasn't going to sleep. At about 4 o'clock, I realized that I should put on my boots so that if anything did happen, I would be ready. After having stayed up and kept alert for so long, the sound of my friend's car alarm blaring freaked me the fuck out, and I ran out of that tent. I got about 2 steps before something grabbed me around my mouth. I opened my mouth to scream, but instead felt a person's pinky finger slip between my teeth. Now I've heard that people can perform superhuman feats when they have huge adrenaline rushes. In my case, I just clamped down and felt his finger pop off. He screamed and pulled his hand away, with the missing digit falling to the ground. He took off running down the hill I was camping on, and I took off right quick in the opposite direction. I must have looked ridiculous to the people whose house I ran to, a little sorority girl in a wife beater, boxers, and steel-toe boots. I also had some blood that had oozed out of my lip, not from the finger, but because I had also managed to take a pretty good chunk out of my own lip as well. I told them what happened. They called the police and got me some real clothing. When the cops arrived, they immediately went to go check out the scene, and when they came back, the sun was already coming out. They brought me back so I could get my friend's car, and what I saw terrified me. Right next to the tent was a red gas can, meaning he could have lit me on fire whenever he pleased. The finger was also gone, suggesting that he had come back. The kicker is, they never caught this guy, so somewhere out there is a man sitting down at dinner, maybe alone, maybe with a wife and a couple of kids, and he's missing his right pinky. My youngest child recently came back from a camping trip with this school. While he was telling me about what a great time he had, I couldn't help but remember my own weird experience while camping in the woods. I'm writing this from memory, so I apologize if it's a bit disjointed. In the year 2000, I was living in my home country of England. I had just turned 23 and had gone through a difficult breakup, losing my home and my girlfriend in the process. Needless to say, I was pretty depressed, moping around my parents' house for a few months while working in a dead-end job. One of my older colleagues, who would always ask me what I had done the previous weekend, which was usually nothing, told me that he had gone camping from Friday through Sunday in a forest area north of my town. The way he told the story of camping under the stars, building a fire, and getting away from it all really seemed to be something I needed to do. I had always loved camping as a young child and teenager, but I was always accompanied by friends or family. The prospect of camping alone filled me with intrigue and excitement for the first time in months. I asked him to specify the kind of equipment I would need and set off to the camping/outdoor store after work. My whole week was filled with planning on where I would go. I bought an ordnance survey map which allowed me to identify interesting places that my colleague had mentioned, and to find the easiest way there by public transport, as I didn't have a car. On the Friday I planned to go, I brought the minimal amount of camping equipment with me to work and left a few hours early. I picked up my stuff and headed to the bus stop, which would leave me at the closest possible location to where I intended to camp. I can remember quite vividly the feeling of calm as the bus trundled along a small country lane, the golden light of the evening streaming in through the windows, filling the warmth on my face. I felt happy, excited, and alive. The depression that I'd been feeling had dissipated. When my stop arrived, I hopped off the bus, pulling out my map and compass and making my way towards my intended destination. The walk took me approximately 1.5 hours to find the area where I had thought about camping. It looked a bit too open for my liking, so I continued onwards another 10 or 15 minutes until I found a place that was a little bit more enclosed. The late afternoon and evening were uneventful. I pitched the tent, cooked some food that I had brought with me on a little gas stove, and laid on the grass and enjoyed the peace and quiet. I remember feeling sleepy as it got around at 10 p.m., so I climbed into bed and read by torchlight. Around 4 hours later, at about 2 a.m., I was awoken from a deep sleep by a noise in the distance directly behind my head. I felt disorientated, unaware of where I was, or even what this noise is. I remember thinking, why is he crying again? Half asleep, thinking it was my little brother who I would often go to when he cried later at night as children. Then suddenly I bolted upright, a shock of remembering where I was and that this wasn't my little brother. With the adrenaline pumping, I could hear even my own pulse. I strained myself to make out the noise in the distance. It was on and off, changing in duration, intensity, and volume. I told myself that it must have just been an animal, and this reduced the anxiety somewhat. I laid back down and checked the time on my watch, 2:15 a.m. Try as I might, I couldn't fall back to sleep. I must have been laying there for 10 minutes when out of nowhere, the noise started again, closer, louder, and weirder. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This time it sounded like crying, and also like they were hyperventilating. It continued for a few minutes, and then stopped suddenly. I began to hear a sort of banging sound, like someone hitting a tree with a blunt metal object, just once at first, and then it became continuous and intense, as though someone wanted to knock down a tree with a metal bat. Then the noise came to a sudden stop, and so too did my breathing. I held my breath, feeling my heart beating furiously, and then I realized that this tent gave no actual feeling of security. As I was starting to calm myself down, a blood-curdling scream echoed throughout the woods and the clearing. I sat upright, my instincts telling me to rip open the tent and just run in the opposite direction of where this sound originated. However, I stopped myself from acting rashly. The scream was definitely of a man. Reflecting on the sound, the only way that I can describe it is that it was full of anger, disgust, agony, and hopelessness, like someone in the pit of despair. Then there was total silence. I could hear some murmuring, like babbling, coming from my east.
Why? Why, Greg? Why?
This was accompanied by this intense crying again, along with what sounded like nonsensical babbling. However, I can make out a few words, which from memory were fire, soil, and sky. I could hear this man so clearly now. This meant a few things. I knew that they were moving towards a deeper part of the forest, but also that they may come across me in my tent.
Why, Greg? Why did you do it? Why did you do it? Fuck you, Greg.
I heard the babbling getting louder. At first I thought that they were just talking louder, but then I heard the breaking of twigs beneath their feet. It sounded like the person was stumbling, sometimes falling to their feet and hitting the ground with something, and then getting back up. At this point I was crouched in my tent, my senses strained to hear and sense where they were, but then it just stopped. I didn't hear any more footsteps, babbling, screaming, or anything like that. It was like the man just evaporated. I remember checking my watch and it was 3 a.m. After a few minutes, I unzipped my tent in the most noiseless way possible and slipped out. I crouched on the grass beside the tent, silently surveying the area where the noise had come from. While still dark, the moon gave off some shine to the area, but I still saw absolutely nothing. There were no noises at all. I think that I crouched there for maybe 10 minutes just staring. Having seen nothing, I climbed back into my tent and laid there trying to process the whole thing. The weird thing was that after some time, I remember thinking that it was over. In fact, I felt very peaceful. I must have fallen asleep at some point after this, as the next thing I knew, the sun was up and streaming through the tent. I got up hurriedly, shoving my stuff into the backpacks and getting ready to go home. I began to make my way towards the bus stop. As I left, I looked around the area for any signs of someone having been there during the night. In my peripheral vision, I noticed what looked to be a black bag on top of a bush of ferns. Despite my experience, my curiosity got the better of me, and I went to check. It wasn't a bag, but an old leather bomber jacket. It was in really bad condition, but I was sure it hadn't been there as I walked through the day before. I didn't want to touch it, but I wanted to see if there was anything inside, so I picked up a stick and flipped it over. I was shocked to see what looked like a big mallet, which are normally made of rubber or wood. Instead, this one was made of metal. After seeing that, I just wanted to go. I more or less ran through the woods and back to my bus stop. After reaching my town, I went to the police and informed them of what had happened. As there was no real crime that took place, they just gave me a funny glance and then gave me a reference number. It's been so many years since this happened, but I still remember it all so vividly. The whole thing was just so weird. Even when I told my friends, they just laughed at me. I don't live in the UK anymore, and I hope I'll never have to run into this lunatic from the woods again. This story happened about 2 years ago while I was in university working on my degree in biology. I'd signed up for a trip to gather samples for an experiment some students in the ecology department were going to run. It required the collection of samples from several sites, so they've recruited biology, ecology, and forestry majors to help them complete the sampling in a shorter period. The area that my group was to take samples from was a few hours from my university in the Pacific Northwest. There were 9 of us in my group, 8 students and a supervising professor. We got to the campsite in the late evening and set up our tents. One of the other students had brought a big container of split pea soup from home and was sharing it with the other students on the trip. I don't really care for split pea soup, so I declined the offer. Everyone had some except me, one other student, and the professor. Come the next morning, the 5 students who had eaten the soup weren't in the best of shape. They were in the grips of some gnarly food poisoning and were in no condition to hike for 8 or 9 hours to collect the samples we needed. The professor who was supervising us made rules for the trip, one of which was that we were to travel in groups of no less than 2, and another requiring that we return to camp before nightfall. Now, these rules were tossed out to make sure we kept to our timetable and collected all of the required samples. We were just told, do your best to complete the work assigned as long as you can do it safely. That morning, I set out for a long day of hiking. After a mile or so, I ran into a stream that I was supposed to follow. I needed to travel about 4 miles upstream, stopping every quarter mile to collect samples of the water and soil. This meant that I had to hustle if I wanted to get back before dark. Halfway through the day, though, I realized that this wasn't going to happen. About 2 miles into my hike, I stopped for lunch, sitting on a log overlooking the stream. The scene was really peaceful, until I smelled the cigarettes. It wasn't the smell of a cigarette being smoked, more the musty smell of a heavy smoker's car where the cigarette butts have been left to ferment for weeks on end. I looked around, but I couldn't see anyone. I just assumed that the wind had blown the scent of some hunter or hiker over to me. But minutes later, the smell still hadn't faded. The vegetation in the area wasn't that thick, but there were still a lot of places for someone to duck behind a tree or bush. I was unnerved that someone was apparently staying close enough for me to smell them for this long without so much as a word. I quickly packed up the trash from my lunch and continued up the stream. The musty cigarette smell went away for the next few hours. It wasn't until I arrived at my last sample location late into dusk that I smelled it again. The woods were getting really dim by this point. Looking back on it, it was a really stupid idea to stay out for so late, as just hiking back to camp in the dark would be pretty dangerous, even without a cigarette-smoking stalker. Having just put the collection tubes in my bag, I shined my flashlight around the darkening woods, looking for whoever was giving off the smell. I didn't see anything that caught my attention. It would actually be more accurate to say, I saw too many things in the dim light that might have been a head sticking out from behind a tree, or someone crouched low in the foliage. I didn't like the idea of being in the dark woods with a stranger who for the second time was lurking near me without revealing themselves, so I began to double time it back down the stream. I made much better time on my way back, even though it was so dark, but even so, I didn't get back to camp until a bit before 10. I was the last one to get back, and everyone but the professor was already asleep. I didn't mention the cigarette smell to the professor because he seemed tired as it was, and he headed to his bed in the RV soon after I got back. I headed to my own tent soon after as well. At some point in the night, I woke up needing to pee. I decided to head into the woods to do my business, as I knew some of the other students were still feeling ill and needed the RV toilet for more urgent matters than just having to take a leak. I walked about 100 feet or so into the woods, found a tree and did what I needed to do. As I turned to go back to camp, something caught my eye. Somewhere off into the woods there was a tiny red glow. I was confused as to what it was until it flared momentarily, and I realized it was the cherry of a cigarette. I stood there for a while watching the red ember glow, fade, then move slightly closer to the ground, as whoever was smoking would take it out of their mouth. Not being able to see the person, I assumed that they were watching the camp. I didn't know if they had seen me make my way into the woods or not, as the fire had been doused and the moon was only half full, so there wasn't very much light. I made my way slowly back to camp as quietly as I could and entered the RV to wake the professor. I told him about the person smoking in the woods and about the smell of cigarettes earlier that day. However, when we got outside the RV, the ember from the cigarette was gone. My professor woke the other student who hadn't come down with food poisoning, and we took turns watching over the camp. I didn't see or smell anything else when I was on guard duty, and went to sleep when the professor woke up for his turn. In the morning, the professor, the other student, and I went to where I guessed the smoker had been standing the night before, and sure enough, we found about 10 cigarette butts on the ground next to a tree. The tree itself looked like someone had been twisting and stabbing a knife or some other sharp object into it, as the bark and outer layers of wood had been damaged and chipped away. The professor decided that the group should head back that day, even though we hadn't collected all the samples we were assigned to, just to be on the safe side. We packed up camp and drove down the thin dirt trail without incident. The second we got onto the paved highway though, a white-paneled van pulled out of a clearing just off the shoulder and began to follow us. The van stayed behind us all the way back, pulling off the highway when we did, taking the same surface streets that we did, and only stopped following us when we turned onto the road leading to our university campus. Everyone was freaked out by this, but it was around 9 at night on a weekend, so the security office on campus was closed. We decided to unload the RV and call it a night, as the van hadn't followed us on a campus. I offered to help the professor catalog and store the collection tubes from our trip, so it was another couple of hours before I left the biological sciences building and began to head towards the dorm building that I lived in. I stepped out into the cool night air and began walking, my professor having left the building in the other direction to get to his car and drive home. I was a couple of dozen feet outside of the building, which was now locked, when I was hit with the musty smell of old cigarettes. I looked around, and about 25 yards away in the darkness off of the footpath, I saw the cherry of a cigarette smoldering away. I was pretty scared at this point, but hoped that it was only a student or some other faculty staying late and having a smoke. I couldn't completely convince myself of this, as the musty cigarette smell was the same that I smelled in the woods the previous night. I began to move down the footpath, and soon passed whoever was smoking. 100 feet or so later, I looked over my shoulder and saw the cigarette cherry bobbing in the darkness. The smoker was now following me. This creeped me out a bit more, but I still held it together. That is, until I rounded a small stand of trees and saw a white-paneled van alone in the parking lot. I took off at a sprint towards my dorm building. I looked over my shoulder a few steps into my run, and I saw the cherry of a cigarette fall to the ground, and a dark shape begin to move after me. I didn't look back again, but I could hear someone running on the grass off the footpath. I got to the entrance of my dorm building and frantically waved my keycard in front of the card reader. As soon as I heard the soft beep, I opened the door, jumped through and shut it quickly. I stopped and peered through the glass door. I saw the dark shape stop just short of the lit pathway. I just watched for a minute or two. Then I saw the spark of a lighter. The light was just barely enough to illuminate a shaggy beard and brim of a baseball cap, before it disappeared and was replaced with the red glow of a cigarette. I turned and headed upstairs towards my dorm room. By the time I got to my window overlooking the same yard I'd just run through, there was no trace of a dark figure or of a cigarette cherry. After that, I didn't see that white-paneled van again, or smell that musty cigarette smell, and I hope I never do.